I'm here with author of Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, Dr. Leigh Fought. This book features the women in Frederick Douglass's life and puts them in the spotlight, where usually in our common understanding of history, Frederick Douglass gets the spotlight. And so this book is really important because it shows us many of the unnamed or named women in Frederick Douglass's life who had a lot of influence. And I wanted to start by saying two high points. Number one, it truly felt like this was the story of the women in Frederick Douglass's life, and he was the linear thread that connected their stories together. In the first half, it seemed more like he served like a cameo role. Like you watch TV shows and you're like, oh, wait, I know who that is, right? So you have this foundation of knowledge. You know Frederick Douglass, so he makes, subtle appearances kind of in the first half of the book. And in the second half of the book, he kind of moves into a more supporting role with women still at the front. So I thought you were really able to highlight these women and enlighten me in the sense that I didn't know so many of them existed. And when we think of Frederick Douglass, it's kind of like he's an all-encompassing ideal of his time period in civil rights. So your questions kind of begin and end when you hear Frederick Douglass. Like, you know everything you need to know. So it was really nice to me to get a name to some of these unnamed women. And it reminded me reading of presidents, too, how a lot of us, we know presidents, but we don't know the first ladies. My second, perhaps smaller compliment was I like how you shared your thought process and considered multiple views and provided evidence for everyone. Like, you were like, well, this evidence shows this, which could mean this, but this evidence suggests that. I felt like I was with you processing this information instead of being a totalitarian. Like in your delivery, you invited the reader along for the ride. That's how I felt. So why don't we start? Did you want to just sum up your book experience here?
No, thank you. I mean, no, your first point, actually, I hadn't thought of it that way from a reader's point of view. But yes, there is this break right around the Civil War because I noticed his own, even his rhetoric, but also the arenas he started to move in around the Civil War and afterwards were the kind of arenas that were not feminine. They were very masculine arenas. You've got the military and recruiting for the military, and then you've got the politics of the Republican Party. All of that is very masculine. And he then plays a supporting role with the women's rights movement. In fact, he was kind of a better ally to them often than they were to him. Whereas the beginning part, his rise to get to the point to be important in that area, that was a very feminine sort of an activist arena. And so, yeah, the fact that they are much more focused at that beginning part and then he moves more to the front in the second part, yeah, that makes him a lot more. I hadn't even thought of that. I was struggling with keeping him in the background in that second part, but yeah. So it was interesting to see it from a reader's point of view. And also your second point, thank you so much. Because, people, oh, readers don't want to hear about your process. And I'm like, but they need to know this so they know that, like, why am I saying this when another book says something entirely different? And then right now I'm working on Sally Hemings. And I thought I had nothing new to say. But when you start reading the footnotes of other people's and reading the sources that other people have, you start to realize, oh, that's just their opinion. And so you can come up with your own. And so you want to explain to the reader, again, you can look at it that, like you said, you can look at it this way and you can look at it this way, but here's another way of looking at it.
And if you don't mind me saying, we've been friends on Facebook, and there are some sticklers in the history community that may just hard disagree if you make a flat out point. So I think it's even higher minded and more respectable that you consider other points of views.
Yeah. And again, I think of it as math, like in math. In math, you're always told, show your work.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I think history, you should do that. And while a lot of times people want you to put it in your footnotes, nobody reads the footnotes.
So my first question.
Okay.
Why Frederick Douglass?
Why not? No, seriously. Actually, if you had told me when I first went to graduate school that you're going to write a book on Frederick Douglass and women one day, I would have said, what? It just ended up that I had a job. Well, okay. I started assigning the Frederick Douglass narrative when I was working at a community college in Houston. And you didn't really get to pick the books you assigned. They gave you an array of books, and then you could pick from them. It just had to do with your part-time. Well, it's a long story that's boring and not important. Anyway, I assigned the Frederick Douglass narrative, and that was the first time I think I remember reading Frederick Douglass's narrative. I had a vague idea that maybe I read it earlier, or parts of it earlier. But it was just such a powerful statement of a mind and a human being and their urge to be. And it just so moved me. It was like one of the most profound reading experiences I remember. And I was so moved by it. But again, I never thought anything more would come of it. And then when I graduated and I got a job at the Frederick Douglass Papers publishing his letters, in a volume that's probably sitting over here in the library somewhere. And that got me into really deeply into the weeds of his life, especially that early period of his life where all the women are. So for 3 years, I just lived in his life, and everything about him was so impressive. And then the women around him, the people around him, that whole movement of taking this institution that was so embedded in American society, and even behind that institution, the racial attitudes, and trying to end it. And not just the institution, but the attitudes beyond the institution. That was so impressive. And then how you have this sympathy where when you start thinking about these broader systems, not just slavery, but the racism that undergirds it, and then the patriarchy that undergirds that. And you want to take all of history and turn it around. So that's kind of what brought me to the story. And I every time I think I'm done with Frederick Douglass, like I've said my piece, and I do believe right now I've said my piece, that you do find new layers of him, because there's even a point where part of it is I want somebody to pay me to go follow his footsteps through Europe. But even there, he's involved in understanding what Western civilization is right at the moment that Europeans are creating this idea of Western civilization that we then are, well, we're not teaching it anymore, but that people started teaching as a way of creating imperialism. And he's trying to understand that and also challenge it and understand his place in it as an intellectual African American. So he's endlessly fascinating. So, and I confess I did fall a little bit in love with him along the way.
Of course. You mentioned at one point he excluded a lot of female narratives in his autobiographies because he wanted to shield them from public scrutiny. Mm-hmm. He wanted to appeal to white readers, but by doing so made black men the face of the black movement. Did he do a disservice to women in this way?
Well, that again, that's something I struggled with. I'm sure a lot of black women historians and even white women historians would, take me or take him to task for that. Again, this is where you've got this very tricky path he was walking and a lot of African American activists were walking, in that he's wanting to help women, he's wanting to help African Americans, he's challenging racism, and at the same time wanting to help women who are challenging sexism. And then you have black women who are doing both. And part of what both groups are trying to do, in order to get heard, you have to be impeccable. So like the whole issue with the bloomer costume that the women were wearing as part of dress reform, part of the reason they abandoned it was that people were focusing too much on the dress and not enough on the message. They call it today the politics of respectability. You want in, so you present this respectable front. But there are problems with the respectability in the first place, the problems with the middle-class family in the first place, the problems with the sexism that you have to, in order to tell the story of enslaved women, you have to walk this fine line between exposing them to, the sexual criticism and the stereotypes that were very much in white people's minds in the North and their perceptions. And then knowing that his audience, and the people who are going to be most sympathetic and raise the money are white women. So having to appeal to them. And so he's got to highlight the nice white women along the way, even though they are limited. And then, of course, there's the issue of black manhood. That and black manhood is fighting against this idea of either the brute, the animalistic black man, or the boy, working within patriarchy. And so you've got all of these intersectional issues and trying to navigate all that and fight all of that. And again, it becomes incredibly complicated. So yeah, in some points he's a very practical, tactical man, and some of the tactics did, as a black man, mean that you had to give short shrift to women and black women. And at his best, he was there promoting black women wherever he could. But it wasn't like he was leading the charge of black womanists.
So I actually noticed reading that comfortable gender roles actually were a privilege.
Yes.
Because I noticed that their daughter, Frederick and Anna's daughter, Rosetta, had to, as you said, oscillate. She had to be at home in the private sphere with her mother and in the public sphere on the road or helping her father with the professional stuff. So reading that, it occurred to me that Rosetta didn't have that privilege of a sphere.
Rosetta, what was so painful with Rosetta is how much of a daddy's girl she is. She's the only girl, especially after her little sister died. And she's the oldest, and I'm the oldest, and the only girl, so kind of related to that. But so she's got so much responsibility there. She's expected to help her mother, and well, if you think of this, her brothers, all they have to do is focus on dad and follow in dad's footsteps. Now, that's not easy, obviously, because when your dad's Frederick Douglass, but she's both got to live up to her dad's expectations and her mother's.
Right.
And she doesn't have any models for that in black womanhood around her. And so she's trying to navigate that. She's trying to, she's ultimately has to be the breadwinner in her family because her husband's not reliable as a breadwinner. So that kind of, she's trying to live a middle-class lifestyle but has to live a working-class life. So yeah, she's trying to do all of these things at once, and she's got 7 kids and buries 2 of them. It's just,
and a handful of a husband, as I read.
Yes,
but
I so wanted to rescue Nathan, and he kept working against me.
As I was reading, I got the impression that Frederick Douglass was almost born with this innate sense that slavery was wrong. It was from the youngest age, he was so aware and intuitive of his position and how wrong it was. Did he lack the same intuition and razor-sharp sensitivity with regards to women's rights? And I noticed this particularly reading when he described Sojourner Truth as uncultured, unrefined, and lacked elegance.
Yeah, well, I think in that case, I think he came to women's rights naturally because he comes out of an environment in which women are working equally with men. I mean, when you're coming out of the slave environment, you're seeing women work. That's why you would think a middle-class separate spheres thing is privileged. And then he goes through the working class, and then he moves into the abolitionists. So he's coming to this understanding that women's rights are a natural extension. But when he encounters Sojourner Truth and the way he describes Sojourner Truth, that's a class distinction. And if you think about, he makes statements all through, there's asides all through his speeches and his letters, but his idea is that slavery is keeping black people in kind of a lower class status when they can come out of it the way he did. And so in a certain sense, he buys into the pull yourselves up by the bootstraps, which is why he's very popular with right-wing people. But he also is aware that there are racist and structural problems that prevent that pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. So a lot of his reaction to Sojourner Truth is a reaction of an intellectual and a man who is striving to become more intellectual, a man who wishes he could go to Harvard. I mean, so this is a middle-class, educated response to a woman who is working class, proud of being working class, and very evangelical.
So my last question, it really actually was eye-opening to see how racist and segregated the North was. A lot of people, today say that the history's in the past. We should get over slavery. There's all this controversy about critical race theory. What would you say to these people?
That it's, okay, first of all, it's not that slavery ended. It's what came after slavery and what came after that and what came after that and what came after that. It didn't end. And second of all, even when you're looking at the end of slavery, and this is where the reparations discussion comes from, slavery, okay, so you end slavery. Okay, first of all, the South is not where we keep our racism. In fact, there's a Southern historian, C. Van Woodward, and he's got this book, it's like the book on segregation and the rise of Jim Crow called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And he pointed out that actually at the end of the Civil War, the most segregated place in the country was the Midwest. That is Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, that whole area there. And he said that, because they had such strict segregation laws there, laws that essentially kept black people out of that state, the states, that they kept people separate, whereas in slavery, people are living together. That doesn't make it okay. Okay, right. Just want to be clear. And that when you pass the 14th Amendment, that applies nationally. So they're desegregating facilities even in places like Philadelphia, in New York. The voting rights applies, the 15th Amendment applies even to places like New York where they still have restrictions on you have to be, if you're black, you have to have so much property to vote in New York. So of course now I'm getting into a history lesson, but if you follow the law, like prison labor, okay, now the system, the way that the criminal justice system is unequal. If you look at all of the data, it's not slavery ended, it's in the past. That it's morphs into different things, that there is something that underlies these systems that perpetuates them. And we're all implicated in it in some way, where you're navigating it. A little bit like Douglas is trying to navigate patriarchy. You make bargains with it. Because you have to survive in it. So the big question is, how do you overturn it? And rather than deny it exists, look at it and figure out how to dismantle it. But there's something else going on in people who want to deny it that, it's really uncomfortable.
Roe v. Wade was overturned, and I naively believed that progress was permanent, number one. And number two, that hundreds of years solidified things, and it doesn't.
No.
And I was shocked reading your book that the law has changed, the Constitution has changed, the mindsets have not.
No.
And that is the scariest thing to me.
Yeah.
There are still people that think that way.
Yeah, and that's the underlying thing.
Yeah.
That's the thing that supports slavery. You can go and ask, would you support slavery? Oh, hell no, slavery's bad. Okay, well, what about, the way black men are generally treated by police? And some of those police are police of color. That's, well, a lot of white people would say, well, they had it coming, or they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing, or it's the police. They should listen to the police, and and whatever the excuse is. But it's like, okay, but this is a pattern. It's that thing that undergirds everything. And I was just doing the Sally Hemings stuff. I was going back to her grandmother, who was supposed to have been African, and looking at the slave trade and just the way people constructed blackness, and then as making an other that was okay to enslave. It goes that far, and it's, how do you undo that?
My last question, I guess, would be, what would you like readers to know?
From the book? Oh, God, whatever they can, actually. Whatever. I mean, everybody goes to the book looking for something different. I would like them to know that history is complicated, people are complicated, that it is possible to be an ally. But, even when you're being an ally, you have to be aware of your own prejudices and what your place is. Because Douglas had prejudices towards women. The women, even when they were on his side, had their own prejudices towards him. Beware of things like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. But these are not heroes. These are people who are trying to get something done. And that it's more interesting to look at history that way.
Well, I want to thank you again. We have Dr. Leigh Fought, author of Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, that you can find on Amazon and most places that sell books. Thank you so much.
Thank you.